Welcome to No Holding Back with me, Susan Estridge. Each week I'll have the privilege of talking with some of the biggest names from the world's media, politics, and law. Nothing is off the table. I'll be speaking my mind and encouraging my guests to do so too. Today, my guest is somebody who I've admired and respected for many years, since she was the only woman in the Watergate prosecution team, one of the first women in the organized crime section of the Justice Department. She's been a trailblazer for women lawyers forever. And I'm just delighted to have Jill Wine-Banks joining me today. She's the co-host of a podcast entitled Sisters in Law. She's been at the forefront of the legal profession throughout her career. And Jill, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you. It's a mutual admiration society, so I am delighted to be able to meet you and talk to you in person.
Well, so am I. Jill, what was it like back in the day? I've always been curious. I've been the first woman this and that, and you've been the first woman this and that, and you were out there in a mini skirt during the Watergate hearings. You cross-examined Rosemary Woods about her tape delay. You really were a superstar and still are. What was it like?
So if I look back to going to law school, and I'll try to make this history short, but I think it's really important for people to understand. I graduated with a journalism degree and wanted to report on law, foreign affairs, politics, current events, real news. And back then there was something called the woman's page. And I kept getting offers to the woman's page. I didn't want that. I wanted real news. I've always been a news junkie and a political junkie. So I thought if I went to law school, I was inspired by Anthony Lewis, a columnist for the New York Times, who had written a book called Gideon's Trumpet, that I had read in college. And I remembered reading that he had gone to law school. I didn't realize he had gone to law school for just 1 year on a Nieman Fellowship after winning a Pulitzer Prize. But I thought that he went to law school and it helped make him a great columnist. So I thought, well, if I go to law school, an editor will take me more seriously and I'll get a better job. I did not intend to be a lawyer. Obviously, I got diverted along the way and ended up practicing law. What I didn't realize is whatever the discrimination against women in journalism was, and I graduated college in 1964, so it's a very different world. Back then, help wanted ads, which were the only way you found jobs, was on a newspaper, a printed piece of paper, and it had classified ads that said help wanted male, help wanted female. And that's how it was back then. So when I went to law school, I didn't realize that only 4% of all lawyers in America were women at the time. So it was even worse than in journalism. And I encountered my first year of law school, my classmates, obviously mostly male, like 96% male. At law school, it was 5%, not 4%. So 95% were male. Said, someone's going to die in Vietnam because you took his rightful place in this class, and you'll never practice law anyway. That was the kind of attitude we were greeted with. And there was no EEOC, there was no women's movement, there was no Ms. Magazine. So we had to deal with that. There was nothing illegal about law firms interviewing us and saying, well, we can't hire you because you're a woman. And everybody else is a man. There'd be travel. We can't let you travel with a man. So that was obviously a huge hurdle to overcome. And as you mentioned, I wore miniskirts. The reason you know that is because headlines throughout the Watergate case always said my name and what I was wearing before what I said. I was identified. One headline called me the miniskirted lawyer. So I was wearing what was appropriate attire. Women were not allowed to wear pants in court at the time, so I had to wear a skirt. And by the way, my first trial ever was in Alaska in January when it was 30 below zero, not wind chill, 30 below on a thermometer, and I had to wear a skirt walking to the courthouse. So that was another hurdle of a different kind. So that's what it was like back then. And I was too naive, I think, to have thought through how I would handle this. And I had no colleagues to talk to. I was the only woman in the organized crime section. So when I realized that the men I started with were trying cases and I was still doing appeals, which is where we all start, I couldn't think what to do except I went to my boss and said, "How come?" And he said, "Well, because you're a girl and you'd be more vulnerable. In appeals, you're just with the judge and other lawyers. In a trial, you'd be with made members of the mob, and that'd be too dangerous for you." And I simply said, "Well, what didn't you notice about me when you hired me as a trial lawyer?" But I have to say that that exchange is part of the reason my book is called Watergate Girl.
Mhm.
Originally, when the publisher said that, I went, "I'll never let my name be on a book called Girl." And my editor said, "What captures the era better than that?" And he was right. And so I now love the title.
You're still the Watergate girl, aren't
I am
you?
still the Watergate Girl. I guess so.
Well, that's an amazing piece of history. I have to say, it wasn't so different when I went to law school. We were up to 10%, and
Well,
we still had Ladies' Day when all
oh
the
no.
girls got called on.
Is that right? Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. I don't
And
think we
and
had that.
I was called on to say, Miss Estridge, if you were lucky enough to get married to a rich guy, basically, what state would you get married in? And I answered California, and the right answer was Texas. So go
Oh
figure,
my
I never
God.
got that right at all.
Oh my God. I thought you were being just bold and brave saying California, where I'm willing to share half and half because,
Right,
yeah. Oh my
right. Well,
gosh.
I wasn't,
Yeah.
that wasn't the point of the question, I'm afraid.
So I'll
Anyway,
tell you a question I had. The first time I was ever on television was on Good Morning America at a time when I was general counsel of the Army and I was being interviewed by David Hartman about a new tank that was in development, which is now the tank we use,
new
the
tank, that's
one.
great.
Yeah. And so I was talking about mean time between failures, how it would perform in desert, how it would perform in, jungle. And we finished the conversation and David Hartman says, "I have just one last question, Jill. Do you plan to have children?" Now,
Are
this
you
is on
kidding?
national television. This is on ABC. My mother wouldn't have asked me that question. And I had to think fast. And I said, "David, that's such a good question. It shows how many options are available to women nowadays." And that's all I said. Now, our mutual friend, Christy Hefner, said, "Oh, that's a great answer." But I would have just said, "Why are you asking, David? Are you interested?" And I still like my answer better, although Christie's are usually the best answers.
Christy's pretty good at this. The first
Yes.
time I was ever on television was Good Morning America with David Hartman.
No kidding.
Isn't that strange?
Oh
Only
my
I
gosh.
was the first woman president of the Harvard Law Review, and they asked me something about whether I was going to do recent recipes along with recent cases. So things hadn't changed that much.
Oh my, oh golly gee, they really haven't. I mean, just think about that. But they have gotten better now. I don't think that would happen now. Um,
No,
I mean, think about how many times you see a courtroom where the judge and both lawyers are women. Think about how many women are television commentators now and television hosts. I mean, it used to be totally. One of my other inspirations was Nancy Haunchman Dickerson, who,
sure, Nancy Dickerson, I remember her.
remember her? She was an early pioneer in television journalism. She spoke to the Freshman Honorary Society at my University of Illinois. And she really, I thought, oh, she's so fabulous, so glamorous, what a great career. And that's one of the reasons, besides Anthony Lewis, that I went to law school. Um, but why I first chose journalism. So both of them were very inspirational to me.
Well, you and I have similar paths. I read Gideon's Trumpet when I was in high school.
Really? Oh my
Yes,
God.
and I dreamt of being a Supreme Court clerk who would pick out that case from the pro se pile. And
Oh my
years
God.
later, when I was a Supreme Court clerk, I kept looking for it and never found it. But I would read that pro se pile and just think, John Hart Ely sat down and he found this case. He became a friend of mine. He was at Harvard Law
Really?
School when I taught there. And yeah, I mean, we read the same books, we went on the same shows, but you have done so many amazing things in your life, including being general counsel of the Army, which you were the first woman, and that had to be quite an experience.
It was. Before I talk about that, I just want to say that my goal has always been, if I'm the first, I don't want to be the last.
No,
And I want to open doors for other women. And I am very proud to say that my successor, when I moved back to Chicago to get married to my high school boyfriend, um, was a woman. So that was really good. But yeah, it was really strange. The interesting thing is that I found it was less difficult there than in many other places where I've been the first. And that's because I had a 4-star rank, and the military is trained to respect rank. And so, and they also felt that as a lawyer, I spoke a different language that they didn't really speak. And so if you start giving them good advice in clear terms that they understand, they start accepting you. It took a while before I felt accepted, but once I really felt very much accepted, and I learned a great deal from military leadership. Having come almost immediately from Watergate, where I had listened to political leadership, the President of the United States being totally immoral and incompetent. And people don't focus so much on his incompetence as on his immorality, but he was also incompetent. And
what way, Jill, was he
well,
incompetent?
well, for example, if you listen to the tapes, you can hear him dithering around and Haldeman saying, "Here's what we're going to do." Haldeman was much more decisive and more directional. I also want to say, whatever bad I will say about Richard Nixon, he did open China to America. He passed Title IX, which was a big thing.
Right.
He started the EPA. So I'm going to give him kudos for some of the things he politically accomplished, and for recognizing the political situation and resigning rather than forcing a impeachment and trial. I mean, he had been articles of impeachment had been voted against him by the Judiciary Committee, but hadn't gone to the full House when we got the information, the one tape that's known as the final piece of information that led to his resignation, the smoking gun tape, in which he can be heard saying, well, we should use the CIA to stop the FBI from investigating this. And in his own voice, there's just no question. And then that's what led to his resignation. But he had the courage to do that. And he wasn't stupid about that. Another tidbit for you is that when the 3 top Republicans went to him and said, "You will be convicted if you don't resign," he decided he would resign. And then he went to Rosemary Woods, who you've mentioned earlier, his top assistant. I think in a different world, she would have been his chief of staff. But in that era, she was his secretary. She wasn't even called administrative assistant, but she supervised a large staff of other helpers for him. He went to her and said, "I can't tell Pat and the girls, you'll have to do it." So he
Really?
told her. She's the one who informed the family that he was resigning and they were moving back to California the next day.
Isn't that something?
Yeah. Yeah.
Tell me what you think of Trump. I can't go talk about Nixon without thinking about Trump.
Well, that's why I'm on television, is because people sort of saw the comparison between Nixon and Trump. My first time on television in my adult life, as opposed to when I was general counsel, was to talk about the Comey firing and
Right.
compare to the Saturday Night Massacre. Trump is far more dangerous than Richard Nixon. I never felt that democracy was at stake. I don't think the right message in campaigning is democracy, because one, certain groups would say democracy hasn't worked so well for me, and it hasn't. others just don't get what democracy means. I think you need to break it down into what we're talking about in terms of various freedoms that we're losing under Donald Trump, or have lost and would continue to lose. I think that his crime is much, much worse. His crimes, and I'm not even just talking about the 91 indictments. So let's just, put it in categories. His abuse of the documents, his abuse of the elections, all of those things are far worse than a break-in. The cover-up that he did at Mar-a-Lago is very similar to the cover-up that Richard Nixon did, but Richard Nixon was covering up a pretty minor thing. It's still a crime and it's still horrible, but it's not the same as trying to overturn an election, trying to prevent the peaceful transfer of power, which is a foundation of our democracy and of our way of government. So I would have to rank Nixon way below the crimes of Donald Trump. And it scares me. I also think Richard Nixon was fully mentally competent. And if you listen to Donald Trump speaking, he is not. And I don't know why the press, maybe you can tell me this, why doesn't the press focus on all of his incompetent sentences? He can't speak a full sentence. He slurs words. He makes up words. He just speaks in non sequiturs. It's very terrifying to me. And now, of course, we're seeing him fall asleep at his own trial. If he's doing that, do you want him sitting opposite Putin or any other world leader falling asleep? I mean, we have to change the image of what we see when we see Trump. His supporters think he's energetic and vital. Well, are they going to just ignore the fact that he can't even stay awake at his own trial? Why is the press not focusing on this?
I don't know why. You're a well-known commentator on MSNBC. You've been around. I've been around. Why are they letting him get away with it?
I don't know. I don't believe what people are saying. Well, it's just because it's good for ratings. I don't think so. Right now, I think it'd be good for ratings for people to see the facts. And for me, the biggest problem we have in America now is, unlike back, and this is a huge difference between the Nixon era and the Trump era. In the Nixon era, we had 3 networks and a couple of national newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and that was it. And they all had the same facts. If you listen to ABC, NBC, or MSNBC, not MSNBC, there was none, or CBS, you heard the same facts. Then you debated policy implications of those facts. You didn't debate the facts. And
Right.
if you don't have the same facts, how can you have a civil conversation? I had a recent conversation where someone was asked, you don't really believe that Trump was cheated out of the election, that there was fraud, that it was stolen? And she said, I absolutely do. I asked,
Right.
well, based on what facts? I don't get to talk to someone who feels that way very often. And she said, well, it's obvious. The Democrats had machines that flip votes. They had suitcases of ballots that they stuffed into the boxes. And I went, hold on a second. You know that there were 60 lawsuits and they all failed because there was no facts. You know that Donald Trump hired the ninjas in Arizona to find more votes for him, and they found more votes for Biden. And she said, well, I just don't believe any of those things. How do you have a conversation? Those are facts. And, to your listeners, I would say you have to really read multiple sources and don't take a reporter's interpretation. When you're reading the paper, if you read online, there will be links. So if it says Joe Smith was indicted, it'll have a highlight on the word indicted. Click on that and read the indictment. See what he's indicted for, and don't take someone else's interpretation. That's how you get the facts. That's how you know what's going on. And if you listen to only MSNBC or to only Fox News, you're getting some perspective on MSNBC. There are differing voices on that. They have Republicans on. On Fox, you're getting one point of view that, if you paid attention to the lawsuit against them by Dominion, you know that they were lying. And they admit that they were lying when they went on saying, this machine flips votes. And they proved that they knew it was false, but they let people come on and say that. So how can you believe them? You know that they lie. They make up things because it's what their audience wants to hear. And we now have silos of information. If you're getting your news from TikTok or anywhere online, the system gives you what you already believe and reinforces it. You're not getting all the news that's fit to print, as we used to say. So facts matter, and that's where we're failing. I am in hiatus from my iGen Politics podcast because my co-host, it was an intergenerational perspective on politics. And my co-host, when we started, was 17. He's now 21, and he just graduated college and is working for the Biden campaign. And so while he's the coordinator of youth communications, he cannot do this podcast because one, it's a full-time job, as you know, from campaigning.
Right.
It's 24/7, but also because he has to focus on saying a certain message. So we're on break, but before that, which just ended about a week ago, we interviewed some of the best minds in the world, politicians and journalists, and anyone who we thought would have an answer. We asked, how do you communicate facts? How do you show people what's true? And the two best answers we got were from Nick Kristof and from Billy Ray. Nick Kristof, of course, is a columnist who I just came back from speaking in Oregon, and which I hope I just said correctly because everybody corrected me from saying it wrong. He also ran for governor for a short while there, but he's back at the New York Times. Billy Ray is a screenwriter, prodigious screenwriter who's done Captain Phillips, Hunger Games, and many others, who is now advising Democratic members of Congress on communications because he felt that his messaging abilities from being a screenwriter translated into politics. And so we asked both of them and got really good answers about, basically, you have to find one fact that the two of you can agree on, one fact, and then you build from there. And there's almost always one thing that even a Trumper will agree is true. And so you build from that. And
What's the one thing, Jill?
well, it depends on the person, obviously. So you have to find something. And when we're talking about one thing, one of the other pieces of advice we got from, trying to remember who, I think maybe Simon Rosenberg, was, if you feel overwhelmed by the issues, pick one and learn it well so that you can persuade other people on that one issue that they should vote for Biden. And I thought that was really good advice, because if you try to take on immigration and free speech and reproductive rights, and go through that whole list, environmental problems, it's very hard to be at your top of your game on all of those issues. So pick one and be able to speak on that, and maybe you can then persuade one person. So in that case, if you have an expertise in the environment, try and find something. Well, yeah, gee, it's really hot this year, isn't it? That may be the starting point for, the conversation about, what do you do about climate change? What are the Democrats doing? What are the Republicans doing? It may be impossible with a true Fox only watching Donald Trump Adoration Society member, because they truly have bought into whatever it is he says. They believe him. And it's hard for me to believe that evangelicals adore him despite his morality, which, I mean, they certainly wouldn't approve of. I don't know what it will take. I haven't been successful. I'm not saying I have succeeded, but at least I have a way to approach the conversation and to try. I'm not going to give up. I will continue to speak what I believe to be the facts are, and I base my knowledge of facts on deep research. If if there's a Supreme Court decision, I read the decision. I try to understand what's at stake. I don't just take the summary that I read in a one paragraph, headline kind of thing. And so I'll just keep on speaking the truth as much as I can.
But it's very hard. I worked on Fox News for almost 20 years. And yeah, and I always said what I thought. I don't think I persuaded too many people of anything.
Well, there's still a couple of Democrats on Fox News, and I'm blocking her name right now. Um, she was another of the guest on iGen Politics, and I don't know how she does it. And I agree, I don't think she persuades anyone. She does offer a pushback and a perspective that the other members of her joint show are all hardcore people. But it's good that they at least have her. How did you feel every day trying to do that? Were you just discouraged beyond belief?
I just said what I thought and tried to find a way in to people's views, tried to occupy the middle because there was nobody in the middle.
Right,
And people were so extreme in so many cases that if I could get in the middle and reach out to them, maybe I had a shot.
right.
But I think it's more difficult now than it was then. And this is, when I started representing Roger Ailes, that was the end of my career on Fox News. It's kind of ironic, but there it was.
How,
Um,
why is that? How did that work?
well, because Roger was on the outs and they didn't renew my contract. That's how
Ah,
it worked.
yeah,
Because
okay.
nobody
That
was
that
allowed
makes
to
sense.
talk to me.
Yeah.
And he was on the outs. And I think Roger was a moderating force on Fox News. I mean, I actually think he would say to people like Sean and others, don't always be so predictable.
It's also not a good advocacy tool to take the extreme position. Um,
I
as
don't
you're
think
saying,
so,
go for
but
the middle, is if you overstate your case, you lose credibility. And people can find that you have overstated it and knock it down just a little. If you're more moderate, you can be
right.
more persuasive, I think.
I think so too. But what about, let me just play devil's advocate for a minute. What about MSNBC? What did you think about their dropping Ron McDaniel?
I think it's a good thing they did. I think they did the right thing. Um, and here's why. I believe we should have multiple outlets that have multiple viewpoints. I think that's really important. But to give a platform to a person who is a election denier, who, from my point of view, engaged in crimes about January 6th in her participation in a phone call about the electoral slate. That to me is giving a criminal and a liar a platform that they don't deserve. Michael Steele is the former chair of the RNC, and Michael Steele can be he is very much a Republican. He believes in Republican policies, and by Republican I mean Republican from my era, when Republicans had small government, low taxes, they still believed in trickle down, things I don't particularly believe in, but I could debate them based on facts on those issues. I can't debate them when they are saying that the election was stolen, and they're still saying that. So I just don't think you can put a liar.
Huge percentage of American people believe that.
Yes, but they believe it because propaganda works. If you say something loud enough, often enough, people will accept it. They don't do the research I'm talking about. They don't look at the facts. And so that's why I think they were right to cancel her contract. And MSNBC said they would not put her on under any circumstances. So it was only NBC that she was going to be on. But that's a big platform.
That's a big platform.
Yeah.
And MSNBC is regularly equated with Fox News. Now, you and I think they're different because we happen to agree with MSNBC and
Yes.
disagree with Fox News. And we say, well, Fox is not telling you the true story. But that's our definition of true.
Well, that gets down to, what is true. And I think that there are facts and that we can know facts. We know that 1 and 1 equals 2. That's a fact. I know that Donald Trump did certain things that we all witnessed and that evidence obtained through grand jury and that will be presented in court, including I haven't followed how many jurors there are as of today for the New York trial, but there were 7 when I went to bed last night. And I believe, given how quickly it's moving, that there will be 12 and maybe some alternates by the end of today. I judge, not today, Thursday, because we're recording this on a Wednesday and the court is in session. So actually, I do know how many jurors there are. There are 7. But I certainly by the end of Thursday is what Judge Merchan has said. But for sure, by the end of Friday, there will be 12 jurors and 6 alternates. And we're going to see the evidence unfold. Let me just rephrase that. We aren't going to see it. We will hear about the evidence. And the reason we won't see it is because New York courts, as most courts, including all federal courts, do not allow cameras in the courtroom. That's something I'd like to just mention is one of my current passions. There is no reason not to have cameras in the court. They do not disrupt the behavior in the court. They're small little things that can be hidden away. And so I want there to be cameras, especially in a case of national significance. Witnesses are viewed differently when you see their demeanor, but also victims of a crime are always allowed to be in the courtroom. And we are all victims of these crimes. This is not a crime of I robbed one bank and all the depositors lost their money. This is a crime where we were all deprived of our rights as citizens. And I think that we deserve to see it. And the only way that can happen is by cameras in the courtroom. I also know that the federal system has tested cameras in the courtroom. And one of my dear friends from Watergate, Judge Charles Breyer,
Charles Breyer.
Okay, so Chuck was one of the judges who tested it, who says, yeah, it was fine. It didn't hurt anything, and it's very helpful. Right. And the George Floyd murder trial is a very good example of people saw the experts testify. They saw the witnesses who saw the murder happen. And they came away believing the case. There was no rioting afterwards. Everybody thought, oh yeah, I saw it and it's true. He's guilty. So I think that having cameras really helps public acceptance of verdicts. Seeing the stuff in Georgia, which so far, all the pretrial stuff is very illuminating. And there's no reason why it wouldn't work on a national scale. So I'm a big supporter of cameras in the courtroom.
What do you think about this New York case? I mean, this is not about, national security or national secrets or anything like that. It's not about insurrection. It's about a hush money payment, which are made all the time to a porn star. It's lurid in its details, but is it really, a lot of people say, and certainly Trump defenders say, this is nothing with nothing. What's your answer to that?
I disagree. And I think that, as we've said, facts matter, so do words. This is not a hush money trial. He is not on trial for paying hush money. That's legal. He's on trial for falsifying business records, cheating on his taxes, and violating campaign laws. This is an election interference. The reason he paid her off was because he was in trouble due to the Access Hollywood tape being released, in which he said, I'm a star. I can grab women by the private parts. And
private
yeah,
part.
well, he used a particular word that probably you don't want me to use. Um, so it is an election interference case, and we should be calling it election interference. At the very least, it's cheating on your taxes, cheating the state of New York by falsifying records. It is not a hush money case. And it's a case in which, honestly, I have to say that Stormy Daniels is much more credible than Donald Trump. That's saying a lot. Is who I would believe in this is Stormy Daniels. And I I know someone, a makeup artist from NBC, used to work for Stormy Daniels, and so I have heard her stories about what a nice and smart woman Stormy Daniels is. So that may color my opinion of her, but just based on her press conferences and her television appearances, I find her completely credible. So there you are. We have a porn star who's more credible than the former president of the United States, and he's falling asleep in jury selection. I mean, this is like, so is he now sleepy snoozing Don? He calls Trump Sleepy Joe. I haven't seen any diminution of the energy of Joe Biden. He's quite energetic.
So you think that this is a serious enough charge against him to bring him down?
Well, that's a different question. I think it is a serious charge. It will not move his base at all. That's unfortunate, but it's true. Although some have said if he's convicted of a felony, that would affect my vote. I'm not sure that it really will bring him down. I do think it's a serious case and a just case. I think that the evidence is pretty clear. And again, Michael Cohen, he can be tarred and feathered by Donald Trump's, Truth Social posts, but he's more credible than Donald Trump. And he'll be a very good narrator of the full story. And the head of the National Enquirer, something that I would, oh my God, I would never work for that kind of an organization. But he's telling the truth when he talks about the catch and kill stuff he did for Donald Trump, where he promoted great stories about Trump that weren't true, and where he, bought Karen McDougal's story to kill it so that it would never come to see the light of day. And so, yes, I think it's an important case. If I had my choice and could pick which case went first, of course it would be one of the two federal cases.
Right.
The document case is really clear-cut evidence, and then you have the evidence of the obstruction, which was the superseding indictment, which is very clear-cut, and you have him lying to his lawyers. I mean, it's really a rich case, but it has a judge who's never going to let this go to trial before the election. Period. That's the end of it. I do not think there's even any hope. The insurrection case, the Supreme Court is interfering by postponing the argument until this week. We're going to have, I can't wait to listen. And again, no cameras in the courtroom, but there is audio. So that's a big step forward. And in an appellate court, you can really listen and hear and get a pretty good sense of things. It would be better if there were cameras, but I'm satisfied with audio for that. And so the immunity argument, which is, I'm trying to think of a polite way to say it, is nonsense. Let's put it that way.
Well, it is nonsense. So why did they take the case, Jill? I mean, this is what I don't understand. Why did they didn't take it the first time around when Jack Smith said this case is important and you should take it and get it decided? And they said, no, we'll send it to the DC Circuit. Well, they sent it to the DC Circuit. The DC Circuit did a great job, wrote a very strong opinion, and now they took it this time. Why?
Well, I'm going to put this back on you too, but I'm going to give my opinion. But because you were a Supreme Court clerk, I bet you may have some opinions that would be very interesting to me. But I will say this, I'm even more bothered that they took it and waited until now to take it and then didn't hear it the next day. And we've seen examples, Bush v. Gore and US v. Nixon were both done really quickly. And this was of the same national import that it should have been. but also that they waited until after a really good opinion was written. They could have, based on that opinion, said, this is good enough. We would say the same
That's
thing.
right.
So
That's right.
it is very troubling that if I can understand them not taking it until there was a full record. I mean, I'm saying that I think they should have, like you do, they should have taken it earlier. But if you're going to postpone it for a lower court to fully do this, and secondly, it was fully briefed. They didn't have to delay getting briefs. There's nothing that will be added to what was submitted to the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia in the Supreme Court. It's the same arguments. So why do you think that they took it?
I'm afraid they took it to reverse.
Well,
And that just strikes me as so outrageous that I don't know what to do about it.
I may be Pollyanna, Susan, because I still believe, despite the record of the Supreme Court, so despite the facts, that even they could not go so far as to say he could commit murder. He could send SEAL Team 6 to kill his political opponent and he'd be immune. And the other thing that bothers me, and I'd like your opinion on, is it is so obvious to me that the conduct that he engaged in is so far outside the penumbra of presidential responsibility. He's arguing that anything that's even at the outer limits of presidential authority is immune. Committing crimes is not part of your duties. The Constitution takes from the federal government responsibility for elections. That's a state process. So he has no responsibility for elections. He was acting clearly not as president. He was acting as candidate to protect himself. So to me, the fact question is the end of it. And what I worry about is the Supreme Court's going to say, well, there wasn't a full enough hearing on that. And they'll send it back to see whether it's within the confines of presidential responsibility. But I don't know. I've argued in the Supreme Court, but I have never, that was once. That doesn't qualify me as the expert that you are.
Well, I don't know that I'm an expert, but I think I'm very troubled. That's the word we use, right? I'm
Right.
very troubled because I'm afraid that there was no reason for them to take this case.
Yeah.
And because there was no reason for them to take it, then why did they get at least 4 votes to take it? And you have to say, they didn't get
Scary.
4 votes to affirm.
Yeah. It's very scary, very scary. The argument on Tuesday about the January 6th obstruction of proceeding statute is also troubling in how they responded. I think Solicitor General Prelogger is amazing and did a great job, but their questions obviously raise some concerns. And again, it's so obvious to me that the word otherwise changes everything and means that it's not just document destruction,
Right.
it's any means.
So
and
that people know
was
what we're talking about, this was the case in which the insurrection statute was at issue as to whether it applies to the January 6th rioters. And I call them
well, it's
rioters.
actually the Sarbanes-Oxley
Right.
statute, which was passed after Enron to make clear that there was a gap, or to cure a gap in whether or not destruction of evidence could be an obstruction of an official proceeding. And so the question was, it also includes a paragraph, not just about destruction of documents, but it says, or otherwise, in any way, shape, or form is what otherwise means, obstructs an official proceeding. There's no question that the counting of the ballots is an official proceeding of Congress. And or at least in my mind, there's no question about that. And so the question is whether obstructing it by violence. And the Supreme Court questioning, well, what if someone sitting in this courtroom starts screaming and shouting and has to be removed? Would that fall within an official proceeding? And, the answer is, that's not what happened. You had a mob violently attacking and killing people and pepper spraying them and breaking windows. That's not the same thing as someone standing up and exercising their free speech rights and then being removed. And, even if there's a series of 10 people in the room who do that, that's not the same thing. And so is that an obstruction? If it delays you for the 2 minutes that the person is speaking and being removed? No, it's not. And yes, it is when the Congress has to flee the building and has to hide and cower in fear that they will be hurt. And it did delay it for, I can't remember exactly how many hours, but at least 10 or 12 hours. That's
Right.
an obstruction. That's different. And it was with an intent to do that. That's different than, protesters stopping a Supreme Court argument.
But the questioning was very troubling
Yeah.
because it made it sound like the judges, justices, at least 5 of them, were prepared to hold that this was just about document destruction and
Yeah.
that this didn't, in fact, close any gaps.
Yeah.
And you have to ask the question, why are they doing that? I mean, why are they bending over backwards? Is it because they're a political institution that people shouldn't have confidence in? And I think that's what's unfortunate right now.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be the consequence, I think. And that's sad. It's just, I mean, they've made so many decisions that I cannot explain. So many decisions. And the country is seeing political unrest because of it. And even a sense of, and people saying, Republicans particularly, saying, don't obey the Supreme Court. You don't have to do what they say. People were saying that, in the border situation in Texas, where the governor did things that were clearly a violation of federal jurisdiction over immigration and over
Right.
our borders. People saying, you don't have to obey the Supreme Court order that you take away the barrels and buoys and barbed wire that you have placed at the border. You don't do that. Don't obey them. That's a serious problem. If we don't obey our laws and our courts, what are we?
Well, I want to ask you one last question because you are the expert on this. The rule of law, that was what Watergate was ultimately all about. And the rule of law triumphed in Watergate. Yes, President Nixon resigned and didn't push it all the way, but it was a triumph for the rule of law. And I worry right now that we're in a period where the rule of law is really in jeopardy. And, Donald Trump, if he runs and loses again, is already prepared to challenge the results of this election. What do you feel about the rule of law now, looking back on your career and your triumph, your early triumph, and what's going on right now?
Well, I think Richard Nixon's resignation was a triumph for the rule of law because he recognized that there were consequences and that the rule of law would oust him in a way by conviction after impeachment. And we don't have any respect for the rule of law by Donald Trump. And so that's why we're in the bad situation we are now. And when I say by Trump, of course, I mean Trump and his millions of supporters. And he does have
Right.
millions of supporters, and they will do anything for him. Although Lawrence O'Donnell has pointed out on MSNBC that the crowds are not coming. He asked for people to come to show support in this New York trial, and the crowds were pretty flimsy. So, is he losing control? Right now, it doesn't seem that way. He now controls the RNC completely. Rona McGrath who was a Trump supporter, who was an election denier, is out. And his daughter-in-law and another Trump loyalist is in. They are spending the money not on other candidates. That's what the Republican National Committee is supposed to do. And down ballot races, they're paying for his legal expenses.
Yeah.
And that's what they're going to keep on doing as long as people keep on contributing. And he'll keep on violating the gag order because it doesn't cost him a penny. His supporters are paying for that. And in the meantime, the taxpayers are paying for this trial, which he is making a mockery of. So the rule of law is how we will survive as a country. And if we don't have that, we're going to have a violent future. I mean, I seriously worry about getting to a civil war in the old fashioned, the 1860, well, we now have an 1864 law in Arizona governing
Yeah.
reproductive rights. So we may be returning our country to 1864 anyway. And that worries me very, very much. I love America. I am very, grateful to be here. But that's why I think it's so important to be engaged, to speak out, to vote, to get out the vote, to learn one subject really well so that you can talk to people who don't share your viewpoint to try to persuade them that this issue is important enough to have them vote for Joe Biden, and to return us to the rule of law and to caring about all Americans, not just the rich ones, and persuading the average Joe that they're going to be taken care of by Donald Trump is ridiculous. So that's where we are, and you're absolutely right to be frightened about where we are. But that's why, keep writing books and get people to, keep writing your columns so that you can persuade people to do the right thing because it's the right thing for them.
Jill, you have been such a pleasure to talk to, and you keep talking too. You keep it up.
Thank
What
you
you're
so
doing
much.
is incredibly important. You've been listening to No Holding Back with me, Susan Estridge. Thank you to Jill Winebanks for being such a terrific guest. Tweet us at No Holding Back FM. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share the link on social media. You can sign up to receive an email when a new episode drops at our website, noholdingback.fm. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time on No Holding Back.